The morning light crept through the tall glass windows of the Cole mansion in Lekki Phase 1, Lagos, the kind of house that made neighbors slow their cars just to stare. Inside, the marble floors gleamed as they always did. The orchids in the entryway were fresh, as they always were. The kitchen smelled faintly of ginger and cloves, the way it had every morning for 25 years. Grace stood at the center of the living room with her hands clasped in front of her. She was 61 years old, and she had the posture of a woman who had learned long ago that dignity was the only thing no one could take from her without her permission. Mr. Emeka Cole stood across from her in a tailored charcoal suit, his phone still in his hand, his jaw tight. "I want you gone by noon," he said. His voice didn't waver. He didn't look at her for long. "Amora will arrange your final pay." The room was very quiet. Grace did not cry. She did not beg. She did not raise her voice or remind him of anything, not the early mornings, not the late nights, not the years. She simply reached into the front pocket of her uniform and produced a plain white envelope, sealed, with his name written on it in her careful handwriting. She placed it on the glass table between them. "For when you're ready," she said softly. And then she turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps barely making a sound on the floor she had cleaned 10,000 times. She did not look back. To understand what was lost that morning, you have to go back. Not to a dramatic moment. Not to a single event. You have to go back to the ordinary days, because that is where Grace lived. In the ordinary days that everyone else forgot. Grace Okafor arrived at the Cole household in 1999. She was 36 years old, recently widowed, and had a 7-year-old daughter named Elena who stayed with Grace's mother in Ibadan during the week. The job was supposed to be temporary, something to get her through the grief, through the financial pressure, until she figured out what came next. What came next was 25 years. She woke before 5 every morning. She prayed quietly in the small room off the back of the kitchen, a room barely large enough for a single bed and a wooden stool where she kept her Bible and a photograph of Elena. She prayed for the family she served. She prayed for her daughter. She prayed for wisdom to know the difference between service and sacrifice, and the strength to keep giving when no one noticed. By 5:30 she was in the kitchen. Nigerian breakfast took time, akara frying in hot oil, custard warming slowly on the stove, fresh pepper soup simmering for Mr. Cole's late-night returns. She knew his schedule better than he did. She knew that he liked his coffee black on Mondays when he had board meetings, and with a little milk on Fridays when he was tired. She knew that his son Daniel slept badly after watching certain films and would appear in the kitchen at 2 in the morning looking for warm milk and company. She always had both ready. Mr. Emeka Cole was not a cruel man in the beginning. He was simply a man who had been so consumed by ambition for so long that he had gradually become fluent in only one language, the language of business. He spoke in figures, in projections, in acquisitions. He spoke of markets the way other men spoke of children. He was brilliant in the boardroom and almost entirely absent everywhere else. His wife, Daniel's mother, had died when Daniel was 4. A swift and devastating illness that took her in under 3 months. After that, Mr. Cole had buried himself in work, not out of selfishness, but out of the particular grief that men sometimes carry like a locked room inside their chest, a room they never open because they are terrified of what they will find inside. And so Daniel grew up mostly with Grace. Daniel Cole was a quiet, observant boy who grew into a thoughtful young man. He learned to read partly because Grace read to him at night. He learned to apologize because Grace modeled it. Once, after she accidentally broke a small lamp, she sat him down and showed him what it looked like to take responsibility without drama. He learned that food was love because she cooked it that way, pressing extra pepper into the stew on cold evenings, making the chin-chin extra sweet at Christmas. He called her Auntie Grace until he was 12, and then simply Grace, which somehow felt more respectful than any title. Lagos moved and breathed outside the gates of the mansion. In the mornings you could hear it, the distant horns from the third mainland bridge, the hawkers pushing their carts along the road, the generator from the neighbor's compound kicking on during load shedding. Grace knew the rhythms of the city the same way she knew the rhythms of the house. She had watched Lagos transform from the outside of that gate for a quarter of a century. She was, in every meaningful sense, the heartbeat of the Cole household. But heartbeats are easy to overlook. You only notice them when they stop. Her name was Lola Collins. She appeared in Mr. Cole's life 18 months before the morning of the envelope, arriving the way a certain kind of disruption always arrives, stylish, confident, with a smile that worked very hard and eyes that were always calculating something. She was 42, a marketing executive, and she wore the kind of perfume that announced itself 3 rooms early. Mr. Cole was taken with her quickly. Perhaps it was loneliness, that locked room inside his chest, Or perhaps it was simply that she was relentless in her pursuit and he had forgotten how to want things for himself. Either way, within 6 months she had a key to the mansion, and within a year she was being introduced at company events as his fiancée. Grace said nothing. She prepared the extra place at the table. She offered Lola tea. She smiled when required. Lola did not smile back. Not at Grace. It started small, the way these things always do. A comment about the way the guest bathroom was cleaned, not wrong, exactly, but delivered with an edge. A rearrangement of Grace's kitchen without asking. Instructions delivered in the clipped, public tone that people use when they want witnesses to their authority. "I'd like the meals lighter going forward," Lola told her one afternoon, not looking up from her phone. "Less oil. Less pepper. We're not peasants." Grace adjusted the meals. "Then, that uniform is old-fashioned. It makes the house look low budget." Grace said, "I'll see what I can do." Then, louder, in front of the household staff, "Is she hard of hearing? I said I want the sitting room done again. The cushions are uneven." The cushions were not uneven. Grace redid them without comment. Daniel watched all of this. He was 23 now, finishing his master's degree, home on a semester break, and he watched with the particular anger of a person who loves someone being quietly mistreated. One evening he found Grace alone in the kitchen, her hands still in the washing-up bowl, her face turned toward the window. "Grace," he said. "HM?" She turned and smiled, the way she always did, full, immediate, real. "You don't have to keep doing that. Letting her speak to you that way." "Ah, Daniel." She dried her hands slowly. "There are many ways to have power. Hers is one way. Mine is another." "What's your way?" She looked at him for a moment, then reached over and straightened the collar of his shirt. "Patience," she said. "And a very good memory." He didn't fully understand it then. There were other moments during those months. Quieter ones. Ones that Grace carried privately, the way she carried most things. Daniel came home one Friday evening with red eyes. He'd had a confrontation with a lecturer who'd accused him of plagiarism. The accusation was false, but the process was humiliating, and he didn't know how to navigate it. He sat at the kitchen table and told Grace everything, haltingly, like someone pulling glass out of a wound. She listened. She made him pepper soup. And then she said, "Write everything down. Every date, every email, every witness. Truth needs evidence, not just your word. You go back on Monday and you present it calmly. Not angry. Calm is more frightening to people who expect you to fall apart." He did exactly that. The accusation was dropped within a week. He never forgot it. Meanwhile, Grace was carrying something she hadn't told anyone. 3 months before Lola arrived in their lives, Grace had gone to the doctor for what she thought was persistent fatigue. The results came back with words she had to look up: a slow progressing but serious illness, manageable but chronic, requiring treatment that cost more than she could quietly handle. She arranged it. She paid what she could. She rearranged her schedule on her days off for medical appointments. She told no one. Not Elena. Not Daniel. Not anyone inside the house. She simply kept going. Because that was what Grace did with hard things. She received them in private, prayed over them in her small room, and then got up at 5 in the morning and made breakfast. It was a Tuesday in March when Lola made her final move. She had been building toward it for weeks. Grace could sense it, the way certain pressures build before a storm, the air going tight and still. There had been a series of small complaints delivered to Mr. Cole in private. A wine glass left with a watermark. A piece of jewelry Lola claimed had gone missing from the guest bedroom. The implication, never stated directly, always implied, that Grace could not be fully trusted, that her presence in the house was a liability. Mr. Cole was distracted. He was in the middle of a large acquisition, 3 companies at once, the kind of deal that consumed the bandwidth of even a brilliant mind. Lola understood timing. She chose a morning when he had been awake since 4, when the stress of the deal had made him shorter, more reactive. Over breakfast she told him she wasn't comfortable. That she felt watched. That the house felt like it had loyalties she wasn't part of. "She's been here 25 years, Lola," he said, though his voice lacked real conviction. It was the voice of a man stating a fact, not defending a person. "That's exactly the problem," Lola said. "She thinks she owns the place." He didn't fire Grace that morning. He thought about it. He told himself he was being rational, weighing everything. But rational thought, when you are exhausted and someone is pressing every available hour, tends to curve in the direction of least resistance. He called Grace into the living room the next morning. She already knew. She had learned to read the atmosphere of the house the way a sailor reads weather. She had already gone to her room, retrieved the envelope she had prepared weeks ago, not in desperation but in quiet clarity, because Grace believed in being prepared for the things that were coming, and placed it in her pocket. Mr. Cole delivered the news standing up, which told her everything about how uncomfortable he was with it. He spoke in the formal language of business, restructuring the household, new dynamic, transition period. The words moved around the actual truth like water around a stone. I want you gone by noon. The staff in the adjacent rooms went very still. Daniel wasn't home. He had an early lecture. She had not told him it was coming, because she hadn't wanted him to fight her battle. Grace placed the envelope on the table. She said, "For when you're ready." She walked to her small room. She packed one bag. She had always lived lightly in that room, as though she had always known she was a visitor, not a resident, in other people's permanence. Her Bible. The photograph of Elena. 2 changes of clothes. A small carved wooden cross that her late husband had given her in the first year of their marriage. She passed Lola in the hallway on her way out. Lola looked away. Grace paused. "I hope you take very good care of this house," Grace said, without irony, without bitterness, with a gentleness that made Lola's jaw tighten. Then she walked out the front door. The orchids were still fresh in the entryway. No one had thought to ask who arranged the standing order with the florist every week. Daniel found out at noon, when he came home between classes and found the house different, not in any visible way, but in the way a room feels when a certain kind of presence has left it. He asked Amora, the house manager. Amora looked at the floor and told him. He called his father 4 times. Mr. Cole did not pick up. He sat in the kitchen for a long time, at the table where he had done his homework, where Grace had sat across from him and helped him understand long division, and essay structure, and how to apologize, and how to be calm when the world was not. He sat there and felt the full weight of what had been allowed to happen. He did not cry. He had learned, from Grace, that grief was allowed its time, but not its full reign. He called her number. It rang twice. "Daniel," she said, warmly, as though nothing had happened. "Grace, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I wasn't there." She said softly. "You were exactly where you were supposed to be. Go finish your lecture." "I'm fine." "Where are you?" "Going home," she said. "Going to see Elena." She hung up. And Mr. Cole came home that evening to a house that smelled like nothing in particular, and had dinner that Amora had ordered from a restaurant, and sat at his dining table in the quiet and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific discomfort of a man who has made a mistake he cannot yet fully name. The envelope sat on the glass table where Grace had left it. He walked past it twice before going to bed. He opened it at 2 in the morning. He couldn't sleep. This was not unusual, he rarely slept well during a major acquisition, but tonight it was different. The house was too quiet in a way that felt specific, pointed, like a kind of accusation. He went downstairs in his robe, poured himself a glass of water, and stood at the table for a moment looking at the envelope. He picked it up. Inside were 3 items, folded with characteristic Grace neatness. The first was a series of receipts, stapled together, spanning 6 years, from 2003 to 2009. They were payment records for school fees, Daniel's school fees, specifically, during the years when the company had come close to collapse and Mr. Cole had quietly, desperately reduced household expenditure across the board. Daniel had been in a private school in Victoria Island. The fees had somehow continued to be paid, uninterrupted. Mr. Cole had assumed his accountant had found a way to manage it, had been too overwhelmed at the time to investigate. He read the name on the receipts. He read it twice. Grace Adiz Okafor. She had paid Daniel's school fees for 6 years. Out of her salary. Every month. Quietly. Without telling him. Without telling Daniel. Without asking for anything in return. He sat down. The second item was a legal document, printed and signed and notarized, from 2008. That was the year the company had nearly died, the year he had needed an emergency capital injection to survive a brutal market contraction and a collapsed partnership. He had found it, an anonymous investor, channeled through a small investment vehicle, who had put in an amount that, at the time, felt like salvation. In exchange, the anonymous party had received 10% equity in Cole Consolidated Holdings. He had always known the investor existed. He had never been able to fully identify them. The vehicle had been a trust, and the trustee had maintained strict confidentiality. His lawyers had told him it was a private arrangement and the investor had specifically waived all board involvement. He looked at the name on the document. Grace Adiz Okafor, settler. the 10%. His company was now worth, by last valuation, over 4 billion naira. Grace's stake, held silently for 15 years, compounding as the empire grew, was worth more than he could process at 2 in the morning in his robe on a marble floor. She had never called it in. Never mentioned it. Never leveraged it. Not once, in 15 years, had she used it for anything except to quietly watch the company she believed in grow. He sat for a very long time with that document in his hands. The third item was the smallest. It was a medical report, 2 pages, from a hospital in Lagos Island. His eyes moved through the clinical language slowly, the diagnosis, the treatment schedule, the prognosis. The date on the initial diagnosis, 14 months ago. She had been sick. She had been receiving treatment. She had been waking up every morning before 5 and praying and making akara and helping Daniel with his problems and absorbing Lola's hostility and arranging the orchids, all while carrying this, alone, in her small room. Emeka Cole was not a man who cried often. He cried then. Not the composed, dignified kind of crying that looks good in films. The other kind, the ugly, chest-heaving kind that comes when something breaks open in a person that has been sealed for a long time. He cried for his dead wife and the grief he had never properly processed. He cried for Daniel, who had been raised by a woman he had just thrown out of the house. He cried for Grace, for every morning she had woken up in that small room and chosen to serve a family that had never once asked what she needed. He cried until he had nothing left. Then he sat in the silence of his too large house, and he looked at the orchids in the entryway, and he thought about the first morning they had appeared. Grace had arranged them, decades ago, because she said a home should smell alive, and he understood, completely and finally, the difference between what he had built and what she had quietly been. He called Lola the next morning and ended the engagement before 8 a.m. He did it calmly, without cruelty, but also without negotiation. She asked why. He said, because I've been looking at value the wrong way for a very long time, and I don't want to keep making the same mistake. She hung up angry. He sat with that for approximately 90 seconds, then called Daniel. Where is Grace? Daniel's voice changed immediately. You read the envelope. Where is she, Daniel? She didn't want me to tell you. I know. His voice broke slightly. Please. There was a pause. She's at the Lagos Island Specialist Hospital. She was admitted 3 days ago. Her treatment, it escalated. Elena flew in from Abuja. He was already moving. The hospital corridor was not the world Mr. Cole usually moved through. He was accustomed to glass offices and valet parking and rooms that smelled of money. This corridor smelled of antiseptic and effort. He walked through it in the same tailored suit he wore to boardrooms, holding the envelope, and he felt profoundly, usefully out of place. Elena was in the hallway outside the room, a woman in her mid-30s with her mother's eyes and a wariness that she did not immediately conceal when she saw him approach. She had heard things. She knew the shape of what had happened. She's resting, Elena said, stepping slightly in front of the door. I know, he said. I just want to see her. Why? He looked at this woman, Grace's daughter, who had grown up in Ibadan with her grandmother while her mother worked in someone else's house, who had spent her childhood weekends with Grace because the weekdays belonged to the Cole family, who had probably learned to share her mother with a different world before she understood why. He looked at her and he didn't have a clean answer. Because I was wrong, he said. And she deserves to hear it from me directly. Elena studied him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. The room was small and clean. Grace was sitting up slightly in the bed, not lying down. Grace was not the kind of person who lay down unless absolutely necessary. She had her Bible open on the blanket beside her, and she was looking out the window at the flat gray sky above Lagos Island when he came in. She turned when she heard the door. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, in her ordinary voice, as though they were back in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, "You read the envelope." He crossed the room and sat in the plastic chair beside the bed, and he put the envelope on the blanket, and he looked at his hands for a moment. I'm sorry, Grace, he said. For the way I let you be treated. For not seeing what I should have seen. For 25 years of, he stopped. He tried again. For taking you for granted. She regarded him with those steady, quiet eyes of hers. I didn't do what I did for thanks, she said. I know. The investment, that was for the business. Because I believed in it. Because I believed in you. She paused. The school fees, that was for Daniel. Because a child should not feel the weight of adult problems. You could have told me. Either time. And then what? She said gently. Then it becomes a transaction. I wasn't doing transactions, Emeka. I was building a family. Even if it wasn't mine to build. He was quiet for a long moment. How long have you been sick? Over a year now. It's manageable. The doctors are good. She looked at him evenly. I was going to tell you eventually. Were you? The faintest trace of a smile crossed her face. Perhaps not. Grace. He leaned forward. The 10%. The equity. That's yours. It has always been yours. I'm going to make sure everything is formally. We don't need to discuss that today, she said. We do. You should have. Emeka. Her voice was calm and firm, the same voice she had used when Daniel was 12 and needed redirection without drama. I am lying in a hospital bed and I am tired and I have not seen my daughter enough this week. Can we please talk about the business another time? He stopped. He laughed, a brief, broken laugh that surprised them both. Yes, he said. Of course. They sat together for a while. Elena came in after a few minutes and sat on the other side of the bed, watching him with careful eyes that gradually softened as the conversation moved into simpler territory. Grace asked about Daniel's thesis. She asked whether the orchids had been replaced. She asked whether anyone had remembered to tell the kitchen to keep the pepper soup on. Nobody had remembered. I'll handle it, he said. I know you will, she said. And something in her tone suggested she had always known, had always seen past the arrogance and the distance and the grief to something redeemable in him that he had not always seen in himself. Daniel arrived an hour later. He came through the door and saw Grace sitting up in the bed with his father beside her, and he stood in the doorway for a moment and pressed his lips together. Come, Grace said, opening her arms. He crossed the room and hugged her, careful of the foreline, and Grace patted his back the same way she had when he was 7 years old and frightened by a storm. You're going to be okay? He asked into her shoulder. I am always going to be okay, she said. This is me we're talking about. He laughed into her shoulder. Elena watched them. Something in her face shifted, not all the way to peace, not yet, but in that direction. Grace caught her eye and extended one hand, and Elena took it, and the four of them sat together in that small clean hospital room while the grey Lagos sky began, slowly, to lighten. 3 months later, Grace was well enough to travel. Mr. Cole had arranged the best oncology care available in Lagos, quietly, without announcement, the same way Grace had done everything for 25 years. He did it not as a transaction or an apology but because it was right, and because he was, finally, learning to do things because they were right. He also had his lawyers complete the formal documentation of Grace's equity stake in Cole Consolidated Holdings, properly transferred, fully in her name, with all accumulated dividends from the past 15 years. Grace looked at the figure on the statement, set it aside, and asked if there was more pepper soup. There was. The Cole Foundation for Domestic Workers and Family Caregivers was registered in Lagos 6 months after that morning in the hospital. Grace had not asked for it. Daniel had proposed it. Mr. Cole had funded it immediately, without hesitation. It provided legal protections, healthcare access, and educational scholarships for the children of domestic staff across Lagos State. At the foundation's first event, Grace sat in the front row in a cream-colored lace fabric that Elena had chosen for her hands folded in her lap, watching a room full of people celebrate something she had never expected anyone to see. Mr. Cole spoke at the podium. He talked about what he had built, the offices, the acquisitions, the empire that Lagos Business Review called one of the most remarkable corporate success stories of its generation. And then he said, "None of it is the thing I am most proud of." He paused. "The thing I am most proud of is that a woman named Grace Okafor believed in this family when we gave her very little reason to. And that somehow, improbably, we became worthy of it." The room was quiet in the way rooms get when the truth walks in without warning. Grace looked at her hands. Elena, sitting beside her, leaned over and rested her head on her mother's shoulder. And Grace, who had spent 25 years tending other people's houses and other people's children and other people's dreams, finally allowed herself the full, unhurried luxury of feeling what she had built. Not an empire. Not a foundation. Something better than either. A family. And a legacy made entirely of love. If stories like this move you, stories of quiet heroism, unseen sacrifice, and the extraordinary power of choosing love over pride, please subscribe to Acts of Hope with Zach. Every story we tell is for someone who needs to remember that goodness is always worth it.